Klaus Richter had not wanted to come to Houska Castle. The assignment had arrived with his transfer orders in October 1943. Report to Special Research Unit 7 operating out of a medieval fortress 60 kilometers north of Prague. No explanation. No details beyond map coordinates and a railway pass. Just orders, delivered by an SS officer whose eyes held the vacant intensity Klaus had learned to associate with Himmler's inner circle, the ones who believed in vril energy and Aryan supermen and other nonsense that had nothing to do with winning a war. Klaus was Wehrmacht, regular army, a conscript who'd survived 3 years on the Eastern Front through a combination of luck and the ability to follow orders without thinking too hard about them. He'd seen men die in snow up to their waists. He'd seen villages burned and bodies stacked like cordwood. He'd seen enough horror to last several lifetimes. But Houska Castle was different. He felt it the moment the supply truck dropped him at the forest road, 2 kilometers from the castle itself. The driver, a Czech conscript who spoke minimal German, had refused to go further, pointing at the limestone cliff visible through the autumn-stripped trees with a gesture that needed no translation. "You go alone." Klaus had walked the remaining distance with his kit bag over one shoulder and his service pistol on his hip, following a path that wound between stands of black pine that grew at wrong angles, leaning away from the castle as if pushed by invisible hands. The forest was silent. No birdsong. No rustle of small animals in the undergrowth. Just the crunch of his boots on frost-hardened earth and his own breathing, which seemed too loud in the dead air. The castle emerged from the tree-line like a rotten tooth. It was smaller than Klaus had expected, more fortified manner than proper castle, its square towers and Gothic windows stained with centuries of weather. But what struck him immediately was the wrongness of its design. The defensive walls, what few existed, faced inward. The arrow slits and murder. Holes pointed toward the castle's own courtyard. And many of the windows, Klaus realized this as he drew closer, were false. Just painted facades on solid stone, giving the illusion of openness where there was only sealed barrier. This was not a castle built to keep enemies out. It was built to keep something in. The main gate stood open. Klaus passed through into a courtyard where brown grass grew in patches between ancient paving stones. 3 Wehrmacht soldiers stood guard near what looked like a makeshift laboratory, wooden crates stamped with SS runes. Electrical cables running through an open door into the castle's interior, and equipment Klaus couldn't identify but whose purpose he could guess: instruments for measuring, for quantifying, for turning superstition into data. "Papers," one of the guards said. He looked young, 18, maybe 19, but his eyes were older. Much older. Klaus produced his transfer orders. The guard barely glanced at them. "Your report to Dr. Kellner. 3rd floor, West Tower." And the guard hesitated, then continued in a lower voice. "Don't go into the chapel. Not at night. Not ever, if you can help it." "Why?" "Because the things down there, they listen during the day. But at night," the guard's hand moved to his rifle, a reflexive motion. "At night they speak." Dr. Oscar Kellner was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and the soft hands of someone who'd spent his life in libraries rather than battlefields. He greeted Klaus in a cluttered office that smelled of old paper and chemical preservatives, gesturing for him to sit in a chair whose upholstery had rotted to exposed springs and horsehair. "Welcome to Houska, Private Richter. You've been assigned to us because of your record. 3 years on the Eastern Front with only minor wounds. That suggests either extreme competence or extreme luck, and we need both. Kellner opened a file on his desk. What do you know about this facility? Nothing, her doctor. Good. That's accurate. Kellner smiled without humor. Officially, we're a meteorological research station. Unofficially, we're investigating certain phenomena that the Reich believes may provide tactical advantages in the war effort. What kind of phenomena? The paranormal, the supernatural, the spaces where physics breaks down and something else takes over. Kellner stood and moved to the window, which Klaus now realized was one of the real ones. Beyond the glass, evening was falling across the forest. This castle was built in 1278, during the reign of Ottokar II of Bohemia. It has no strategic value. No water source beyond a cistern. No kitchen. For centuries, it stood empty. Why? Klaus said nothing. Because it was built over something. A pit. A hole in the limestone that local folklore claims has no bottom. The medieval chroniclers called it Porta Inferni, the gateway to hell. The castle exists to seal it. The chapel, Kellner gestured downward, was built directly over the opening, dedicated to Saint Michael the Archangel. Do you know your scripture, Private Richter? Some. Michael is the angel who fights demons, who casts Satan into the pit. Appropriate, don't you think? The medieval mind tried to solve a problem with prayer and stone. We're taking a more scientific approach. You're trying to open it. We're trying to understand it. There's a difference. Kellner turned from the window. The SS believes there are energies we can harness. Forces that predate Christianity, perhaps even predate humanity. The Führer has authorized us to investigate by any means necessary. He paused. Your duties will include guard rotation, supply management, and assisting in experiments as needed. You'll be billeted in the East Tower with the other Wehrmacht personnel. Questions? What's in the pit? Kellner's smile disappeared. That's what we're trying to determine. Report to Sergeant Dietrich for your duty assignments. Dismissed. Klaus learned the castle's geography over the following days, mapping its corridors and chambers with the tactical mindset that had kept him alive in Russia. The ground floor held storage rooms and a makeshift laboratory. The second floor contained living quarters for the 20 soldiers and 12 researchers stationed here. The third and fourth floors were largely empty, abandoned bedrooms whose furniture had rotted to bone and whose walls wept moisture even in the dry autumn air. And below everything, accessible through a stone staircase that descended from the main hall, was the chapel. Klaus avoided it for his first 3 days. He pulled guard duty, assisted in unloading supplies, and tried not to think about the sounds that came up through the castle's stones after dark. Sounds like breathing. Like something vast and patient drawing air through passages that should have been solid rock. But on the fourth night, Sergeant Dietrich assigned him to chapel watch. You'll stand post outside the door, Dietrich said. His face was expressionless, but Klaus saw the tension in his shoulders. Dr. Kellner and his team are conducting an experiment inside. They'll be sealed in from midnight until dawn. Your job is to ensure no one enters. And if you hear anything, screaming, banging, anything, you do nothing. Understood? What kind of experiment? The kind you don't ask about if you want to stay sane. Klaus took his post at 2,300 hours. The chapel door was oak reinforced with iron, easily 6 centuries old, its surface carved with symbols Klaus didn't recognize, circles within circles, geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly, and inscriptions in Latin that his limited education couldn't translate. Through the door came voices. Kellners giving instructions. Others responding. The sound of equipment being moved. Then, at precisely midnight, silence. Klaus stood in the corridor and waited. The cold came first. Not the natural cold of autumn night, but something else, a bone-deep chill that made Klaus's breath come in clouds thick enough to obscure his vision. The temperature dropped so fast that frost began forming on the walls, creeping upward from the floor in delicate crystalline patterns. Then came the smell. Sulfur, yes, but also something organic. Something that made Klaus think of the mass graves outside Stalingrad, of bodies left too long in summer heat. The smell came up through the floor, through the cracks between stones, as if the earth beneath the castle was exhaling decay. Klaus checked his watch. 0100 hours. 5 more hours until dawn. The door began to sweat. That was the only word for it. The oak's surface glistened with moisture that ran down in rivulets, pooling on the floor. But when Klaus touched it, against every instinct screaming at him not to, the liquid was warm. Body temperature. And when he pulled his hand away, the moisture was red. The door was bleeding. Klaus stepped back, his hand moving to his pistol. Behind the door, he heard voices. Not the researchers. Other voices speaking in harmonics that suggested multiple throats producing sounds human anatomy shouldn't accommodate. Then the screaming started. Not one voice. Many. Men screaming in agony, screaming in terror, screaming in something worse than either, the sound of consciousness being torn apart and reassembled into configurations that couldn't support sanity. Klaus's hand was on the door handle before he realized it. His orders were clear: do nothing. But men were dying in there. Men he'd eaten breakfast with this morning. He pulled the door open. The chapel was not what it should have been. The architecture was wrong. The walls curved where they should have been straight. The floor tilted at angles that defeated perspective. And the frescoes that covered every surface, medieval paintings of Saint Michael battling demons, of the weighing of souls, of hybrid creatures being cast into pits, were moving. Not like paintings should move in flickering light, but truly moving. The painted demons turned their heads to look at him. The painted Michael raised his sword. And in the center of the chapel, where the altar should have stood, was the pit. It was perhaps 3 meters across, its edges worn smooth by centuries of contact. Ropes had been driven into the stone around it, modern ropes, military grade, and from these ropes hung chains that descended into darkness so absolute it seemed to swallow the beam of Klaus's flashlight. Dr. Kellner and his team were gathered around the pit. Or what remained of them. Kellner's body had ruptured. That was the clinical term Klaus's mind provided, unable to process what he was seeing as anything but medical trauma. The doctor's torso had split open from sternum to groin, the skin peeling back to reveal organs that were no longer human. His ribs had branched and multiplied, creating a cage of bone that pulsed with its own rhythm. And inside that cage, something looked out at Klaus with eyes that were simultaneously Kellner's and not, human and other, conscious and aware and screaming without sound. The other researchers had undergone similar transformations. One man's head had inverted, the skull splitting apart and reforming around a mass of tissue that resembled a brain, but functioned as something else. Klaus could see it thinking. Could see thoughts moving through its folds like waves across water. Another's arms had fused together and elongated, growing new joints, new fingers, creating appendages that reached into the pit and pulled something up. Something that had been waiting. It emerged slowly, taking its time, savoring the moment. Hands first, if they could be called hands. Appendages with too many fingers, each finger ending in a hook of yellowed bone. Then arms that were too long, the wrong proportions. Covered in skin that looked like leather that had been cured badly. Then a torso that had been human once, perhaps centuries ago, but had been altered through processes Klaus's mind refused to comprehend. And finally, a face. It wore features the way a mask wears paint, loosely, imperfectly, with the original structure visible beneath. The eyes were wrong. The mouth was wrong. The shape of the skull was wrong. But what made Klaus's bladder loosen and his knees weaken was the expression. Intelligence. Malevolence. And, worst of all, patience. This thing had been waiting a long time. And it had all the time in the world. Fleisch, it said. The German word for flesh, but spoken with an accent that predated the language. Endlich. Finally. The transformed researchers moved toward Klaus as one, their rebuilt bodies coordinating in ways that suggested collective purpose. Klaus drew his pistol and fired. The bullets punched through Kellner's chest cage, through the brain mass of another researcher, but the wounds closed almost instantly. Flesh flowing like water to fill the damage. Klaus ran. He burst from the chapel into the corridor and slammed the door behind him, throwing the iron bolt. Behind the oak, he heard impacts, bodies hitting the barrier, hands scrabbling at wood. And beneath that, rising from the pit itself, came a sound like laughter. Deep. Ancient. Amused. Klaus ran through the castle, shouting for the guards, for anyone. But the corridors were empty. The barracks were abandoned. In the courtyard, he found the supply truck still parked, but no sign of the driver, no sign of the soldiers who should have been on watch. And from the castle behind him came sounds. The screaming had stopped. Now there were just footsteps. Many footsteps. And voices speaking in unison, in harmonies that shouldn't exist. Noon. We need 9. We have 5. 4 more. 4 more and the seal breaks. 4 more and we rise. 9. The number from the old legend. Prisoners lowered into the pit. 9 required to open what should stay closed. Klaus ran for the forest. He didn't stop running until dawn, when the forest finally released him onto a country road where a farmer in a cart gave him a lift to the nearest town. Klaus told no one what he'd seen. What could he say? That demons were real? That the SS had opened a gateway to hell beneath a medieval castle? That his commanding officers had transformed into things from nightmare? He deserted. Surrendered to the Americans in 1945. Spent the rest of the war in a POW camp where the worst thing he faced was boredom and bad food. After the war, he returned to Germany. Married. Had children. Built a life that seemed normal, seemed safe. seemed like it was happening to someone else. But sometimes, on clear autumn nights when the wind blew from the east, Klaus would wake to the smell of sulfur. Would hear voices speaking in harmonics that his sleeping wife couldn't detect. Would remember the thing climbing from the pit, wearing its face like a poorly fitted mask. And he would wonder, did they complete the ritual? Did they find 4 more? Did something break free from beneath Houska Castle in those final days of the war when chaos reigned and records were destroyed and no one was watching the forgotten places where old evils waited? Klaus never went back to find out. But sometimes, in dreams, in the spaces between sleeping and waking, he stood again in that chapel. Stood before that pit. And looked down into darkness so complete it had texture and weight. And the darkness looked back. And smiled. And whispered in a voice like centuries of suffering compressed into sound. Soon. Epilogue. Houska Castle, November 1989. The tourists came in buses now, cameras ready, guidebooks in hand. The Iron Curtain had fallen and the mysterious fortress north of Prague was open to the public for the first time in decades. They walked through the courtyard where Klaus Richter had stood 46 years ago. They admired the Gothic architecture. They took photos of the fake windows and marveled at the peculiarity. And they visited the chapel. The guides told sanitized stories. Legends of bottomless pits and medieval superstition. Tales of Nazi occupation, carefully edited to remove the uncomfortable details. They showed tourists the frescoes of St. Michael battling demons. Explained the left-handed centaur as an example of medieval artistic license. What the guides didn't mention, because most didn't know, was that the floor of the chapel had been reinforced in 1946. Steel plates riveted to stone, concrete poured to a depth of 2 meters, a permanent seal ordered by Soviet authorities who'd found things in the castle after the war. Things they couldn't explain. Wouldn't explain. The tourists stood on that reinforced floor and took photos. Some reported their cameras malfunctioning. Others mentioned a feeling of unease, quickly dismissed. A few noticed the chapel was colder than the rest of the castle, even in summer. None of them noticed the cracks beginning to show in the concrete. Fine hairline fractures, spreading in geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. None of them heard the sounds that came at night, when the castle was empty and dark, sounds like breathing from below. Like something vast and patient, still waiting. Still hungry. Still counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 4 more needed. 9 to break the seal. 9 to open the door. 9 to let the old things rise. The tourists left their offerings without knowing, fingerprints in dust. Breath in cold air. The microscopic traces of living flesh that fell like rain and drifted down through the cracks. Through the steel. Through the stone. Down to where old things waited. And counted. And smiled.
If you enjoyed this video, please do not forget to like, comment, or share this video with your friends. Subscribe to our channel to hear more stories like this one.